Hello, dreamers. I'm Phoenix, and tonight we're venturing into the heart of American folklore. These are tales born from the mountains, rivers, and plains, passed down through generations, rich with wonder and wisdom. So take a deep breath, settle into comfort, and let the worries of the day drift away. Together, we'll journey through stories of legendary figures, clever animals, and mysterious happenings, all crafted to guide you gently toward rest. Close your eyes, relax, and let's wander through these timeless American tales, one story at a time. Snowbird, the Caddo medicine man, had a handsome son. When the boy was old enough to be given a man's name, Snowbird called him Braveness because of his courage as a hunter. Many of the girls in the Caddo village wanted to win Braveness as a husband, but he paid little attention to any of them. One morning he started out for a day of hunting, and while he was walking along looking for wild game, he saw someone ahead of him sitting under a small elm tree. As he approached, he was surprised to find that the person was a young woman, and he started to turn aside. "Come here," she called to him in a pleasant voice. Braveness went up to her and saw that she was very young and very beautiful. "I knew you were coming here," she said, "and so I came to meet you." "You are not of my people," he replied. "How did you know that I was coming this way?" "I am Buffalo Woman," she said. "I have seen you many times before, from afar. I want you to take me home with you and let me stay with you." "I can take you home with me," Braveness answered her, "but you must ask my parents if you can stay with us." They started for his home at once, and when they arrived there, Buffalo Woman asked Braveness's parents if she could stay with them and become the young man's wife. "If Braveness wants you for his wife, we will be pleased," said Snowbird, the medicine man. It is time that he had someone to love. And so Braveness and Buffalo Woman were married in the custom of the Caddo people and lived happily together for several moons. One day she asked him, "Will you do whatever I may ask of you, Braveness?" "Yes," he replied, "if what you ask is not unreasonable. I want you to go with me to visit my people." Braveness said that he would go, and the next day they started for her home, she leading the way. After they had walked a long distance, they came to some high hills, and all at once she turned round and looked at Braveness and said, "You promised me that you would do anything I say." "Yes," he answered. "Well," she said, "my home is on the other side of this high hill. I will tell you when we get to my mother. I know there will be many coming there to see who you are, and some may provoke you and try to make you angry, but do not allow yourself to become angry with any of them. Some may try to kill you." "Why should they do that?" asked Braveness. "Listen to what I am about to tell you," she said. "I knew you before you knew me. Through magic, I made you come to me that first day. I said that some will try to make you angry, and if you show anger at even one of them, the others will join in fighting you until they have killed you. They will be jealous of you. The reason is that I refused many who wanted me." "But you are now my wife," Braveness said. "I have told you what to do when we get there," Buffalo Woman continued. "Now I want you to lie down on the ground and roll over twice." Braveness smiled at her, but he did as she had told him to do. He rolled over twice, and when he stood up, he found himself changed into a buffalo. For a moment, Buffalo Woman looked at him, seeing the astonishment in his eyes. Then she rolled over twice, and she also became a buffalo. Without saying a word, she led him to the top of the hill. In the valley off to the west, Braveness could see hundreds and hundreds of buffalo. "They are my people," said Buffalo Woman. "This is my home." When the members of the nearest herd saw Braveness and Buffalo Woman coming, they began gathering in one place, as though waiting for them. Buffalo Woman led the way, Braveness following her, until they reached an old buffalo cow, and he knew that she was the mother of his beautiful wife. For 2 moons they stayed with the herd. Every now and then, 4 or 5 of the young buffalo males would come around and annoy Braveness, trying to arouse his anger, but he pretended not to notice him. One night, Buffalo Woman told him that she was ready to go back to his home, and they slipped away over the hills. When they reached the place where they had turned themselves into buffalo, they rolled over twice on the ground and became a man and a woman again. "Promise me that you will not tell anyone of this magical transformation," Buffalo Woman said. "If people learn about it, something bad will happen to us." They stayed at Braveness's home for 12 moons, and then Buffalo Woman asked him again to go with her to visit her people. They had not been long in the Valley of the Buffalo when she told Braveness that the young males who were jealous of him were planning to have a foot race. "They will challenge you to race, and if you do not outrun them, they will kill you," she said. That night Braveness could not sleep. He went out to take a long walk. It was a very dark night without moon or stars, but he could feel the presence of the wind spirit. "You are young and strong," the wind spirit whispered to him, "but you cannot outrun the buffalo without my help. If you lose, they will kill you. If you win, they will never challenge you again. What must I do to save my life and keep my beautiful wife?" asked Braveness. The wind spirit gave him 2 things. "One of these is a magic herb," said the wind spirit. "The other is dried mud from a medicine wallow. If the buffalo catch up with you, first throw behind you the magic herb. If they come too close to you again, throw down the dried mud." The next day was the day of the race. At sunrise, the young buffalo gathered at the starting place. When Braveness joined them, they began making fun of him, telling him he was a man buffalo and therefore had not the power to outrun them. Braveness ignored their jeers and calmly lined up with them at the starting point. An old buffalo started the race with a loud bellow, and at first, Braveness took the lead, running very swiftly. But soon, the others began gaining on him, and when he heard their hard breathing close upon his heels, he threw the magic herb behind him. By this time, he was growing very tired and thought he could not run anymore. He looked back and saw one buffalo holding his head down and coming very fast, rapidly closing the space between him and Braveness. Just as this buffalo was about to catch up with him, Braveness threw down the dried mud from the medicine wallow. Soon he was far ahead again, but he knew that he had used up the powers given him by the wind spirit. As he neared the goal set for the race, he heard the pounding of hooves coming closer behind him. At the last moment, he felt a strong wind on his face as it passed him to stir up dust and keep the buffalo from overtaking him. With the help of the wind spirit, Braveness crossed the goal first and won the race. After that, none of the buffalo ever challenged him again, and he and Buffalo Woman lived peacefully with the herd until they were ready to return to his Caddo people. Not long after their return to Braveness's home, Buffalo Woman gave birth to a handsome son. They named him Buffalo Boy, and soon he was old enough to play with the other children of the village. One day, while Buffalo Woman was cooking dinner, the boy slipped out of the lodge and went to join some other children at play. They played several games and then decided to play that they were buffalo. Some of them lay on the ground to roll like buffalo, and Buffalo Boy also did this. When he rolled over twice, he changed into a real buffalo calf. Frightened by this, the other children ran for their lodges. About this time, his mother came out to look for him, and when she saw the children running in fear, she knew that something must be wrong. She went to see what had happened and found her son changed into a buffalo calf. Taking him up in her arms, she ran down the hill, and as soon as she was out of sight of the village, she turned herself into a buffalo and with Buffalo Boy started off toward the west. Late that evening, when Braveness returned from hunting, he could find neither his wife nor his son in the lodge. He went out to look for them, and someone told him of the game the children had played and of the magic that had changed his son into a buffalo calf. At first, Braveness could not believe what they told him, but after he had followed his wife's tracks down the hill and found the place where she had rolled, he knew the story was true. For many moons, Braveness searched for Buffalo Woman and Buffalo Boy, but he never found them again. Once upon a time, all the people of a certain country had died, excepting two helpless children, a baby boy and a little girl. When their parents died, these children were asleep. The little girl, who was the elder, was the first to awake. She looked around her, but seeing nobody beside her little brother, who lay smiling in his dreams, she quietly resumed her bed. At the end of 10 days, her brother moved without opening his eyes. At the end of 10 days more, he changed his position, lying on the other side, and in this way he kept on sleeping for a long time. And pleasant, too, must have been his dreams, for his little sister never looked at him that he was not quite a little heaven of smiles and flashing lights which beamed about his head and filled the lodge with a strange splendor. The girl soon grew to be a woman, but the boy increased in stature very slowly. It was a long time before he could even creep, and he was well advanced in years before he could stand alone. When he was able to walk, his sister made him a little bow and arrows, and hung around his neck a small shell, saying, "You shall be called Deus Emid, or he of the little shell." Every day he would go out with his little bow, shooting at the small birds. The first bird he killed was a tomtit. His sister was highly pleased when he took it to her. She carefully prepared and stuffed it and put it away for him. The next day he killed a red squirrel. His sister preserved this too. The third day he killed a partridge, and this they had for their evening meal. After this, he acquired more courage and would venture some distance from home. His skill and success as a hunter daily increased, and he killed the deer, bear, moose, and other large animals inhabiting the forest. At last, Although so very small of stature, he became a great hunter, and all that he shot he brought home and shared with his sister. And whenever he entered the lodge, a light beamed about his head and filled the place with a strange splendor. He had now arrived at the years of manhood, but he still remained a perfect infant in size. One day, walking about in quest of game, he came to a small lake. It was in the winter season, and upon the ice of the lake he saw a man of giant height employed killing beavers. Comparing himself with this great man, he felt that he was no bigger than an insect. He seated himself on the shore and watched his movements. When the large man had killed many beavers, he put them on a hand sled which he had and pursued his way home. When he saw him retire, the dwarf hunter followed, and wielding his magic shell, he cut off the tail of one of the beavers and ran home with the prize. The giant, on reaching his lodge with his sled load of beavers, was surprised to find one of them shorn of its tail. The next day, the little hero of the shell went to the same lake. The giant, who had been busy there for some time, had already loaded his sled and commenced his return. But running nimbly forward and overtaking him, he succeeded in securing another of the beaver tails. "I wonder," said the giant, on reaching his lodge and overlooking his beavers, "what dog it is that has thus cheated me. Could I meet him, I would make his flesh quiver at the point of my javelin." The giant forgot that he had taken these very beavers out of a beaver dam which belonged to the little shell man and his sister without permission. The next day he pursued his hunting at the beaver dam near the lake, and he was again followed by the little man with the shell. This time, the giant was so nimble in his movements that he had nearly reached home before the shell, make the best speed he could overtake him. But he was just in time to clip another beaver's tail before the sled slipped into the lodge. The giant would have been a patient giant indeed if his anger had not been violent at these constant tricks played upon him. What vexed him most was that he could not get a sight of his enemy. Sharp eyes he would have needed to do so, inasmuch as he of the little shell had the gift of making himself invisible whenever he chose. The giant, giving vent to his feelings with many loud rumbling words, looked sharply around to see whether he could discover any tracks. He could find none. The unknown had stepped too lightly to leave the slightest mark behind. The next day, the giant resolved to disappoint his mysterious follower by going to the beaver dam very early, and accordingly, when the little shell man came to the place, he found the fresh traces of his work, but the giant had already gone away. He followed hard upon his tracks, but he failed to overtake him. When he of the little shell came in sight of the lodge, the stranger was in front of it, employed in skinning his beavers. As Dias Imid stood looking at him, for he had been all this time invisible, he thought, "I will let him have a view of me." Presently the man, who proved to be no less a personage than the celebrated giant Manabozho, looked up and saw him. After regarding him with attention, "Who are you, little man?" said Manabozho. "I have a mind to kill you." The little hero of the shell replied, "If you were to try to kill me, you could not do it." With this speech of the little man, Manabozho grabbed at him. But when he thought to have had him in his hand, he was gone. "Where are you now, little man?" cried Manabozho. "Here, under your girdle," answered the shell dwarf, at which giant Manabozho, thinking to crush him, slapped down his great hand with all his might. But on unloosing his girdle, he was disappointed at finding no dwarf there. "Where are you now, little man?" he cried again, in a greater rage than ever. "In your right nostril," the dwarf replied, whereupon the giant Manabozho seized himself by the finger and thumb at the place and gave it a violent tweak. But as he immediately heard the voice of the dwarf at a distance upon the ground, he was satisfied that he had only pulled his own nose to no purpose. "Goodbye, Manabozho," said the voice of the invisible dwarf. "Count your beaver tails, and you will find that I have taken another for my sister." For he of the little shell never in his wanderings or pastimes forgot his sister and her wishes. "Goodbye, Beaver Man." And as he went away, he made himself visible once more, and a light beamed about his head and lit the air around him with a strange splendor, a circumstance which Manabozho, who was at times quite thick-headed and dull of apprehension, could no way understand. When Dais Imid returned home, he told his sister that the time drew nigh when they must separate. "I must go away," said Dais Imid. "It is my fate. You too," he added, "must go away soon. Tell me where you would wish to dwell." She said, "I would like to go to the place of the breaking of daylight. I have always loved the east. The earliest glimpses of light are from that quarter, and it is to my mind the most beautiful part of the heavens. After I get there, my brother, whenever you see the clouds in that direction of various colors, you may think that your sister is painting her face." "And I," said he, my sister, shall live on the mountains and rocks. There I can see you at the earliest hour. There are the streams of water clear, the air is pure, and the golden lights will shine ever around my head, and I shall ever be called Puck Inini, or the little wild man of the mountains." "But," he resumed, "before we part forever, I must go and try to find what Manitos rule the earth, and see which of them will be friendly to us." He left his sister and traveled over the surface of the globe, and then went far down into the earth. He had been treated well wherever he went. At last he came to a giant Manito, who had a large kettle which was forever boiling. The giant, who was a first cousin to Manabozho, and had already heard of the tricks which Dais Imid had played upon his kinsman, regarded him with a stern look, and catching him up in his hand, he threw him unceremoniously into the kettle. It was evidently the giant's intention to drown Dais Imid, in which he was mistaken, for by means of his magic shell, little Dais, in less than a second's time, bailed the water to the bottom, leaped from the kettle, and ran away unharmed. He returned to his sister and related his rovings and adventures. He finished his story by addressing her thus: "My sister there is a Manito at each of the four corners of the earth. There is also one above them, far in the sky, a great being who assigns to you and to me and to all of us where we must go. And last," he continued, "there is another and wicked one who lives deep down in the earth. It will be our lot to escape out of his reach. We must now separate. When the winds blow from the four corners of the earth, you must then go. They will carry you to the place you wish. I go to the rocks and mountains, where my kindred will ever delight to dwell. Dias Emid then took his ball stick and commenced running up a high mountain, and a bright light shone about his head all the way, and he kept singing as he went. Blow, winds, blow. My sister lingers, for her dwelling in the sky, where the morn with rosy fingers shall her cheeks with vermeil dye. There my earliest views directed shall from her their color take, and her smiles through clouds reflected guide me on by wood or lake. While I range the highest mountains, sport in valleys green and low, or beside our Indian fountains, raise my tiny hip hallow. Presently the winds blew, and as Dice Imid had predicted, his sister was borne by them to the eastern sky, where she has ever since lived, and her name is now the Morning Star. Here were 6 falcons living in a nest, 5 of whom were still too young to fly, when it so happened that both the parent birds were shot in one day. The young brood waited anxiously for their return, but night came and they were left without parents and without food. Gray Eagle, the eldest, and the only one whose feathers had become stout enough to enable him to leave the nest, took his place at the head of the family and assumed the duty of stifling their cries and providing the little household with food, in which he was very successful. But after a short time had passed, by an unlucky mischance, while out on a foraging excursion, he got one of his wings broken. This was the more to be regretted, as the season had arrived when they were soon to go to a southern country to pass the winter, and the children were only waiting to become a little stronger and more expert on the wing to set out on the journey. Finding that their elder brother did not return, they resolved to go in search of him. After beating up and down the country for the better part of a whole day, they at last found him, sorely wounded and unable to fly, lodged in the upper branches of a sycamore tree. "Brothers," said Gray Eagle, as soon as they were gathered around, and questioned him as to the extent of his injuries, "an accident has befallen me, but let not this prevent your going to a warmer climate. Winter is rapidly approaching, and you cannot remain here. It is better that I alone should die than for you all to suffer on my account." "No, no," they replied with one voice. "We will not forsake you. We will share your sufferings. We will abandon our journey and take care of you as you did of us before we were able to take care of ourselves. If the chill climate kills you, it shall kill us. Do you think we can so soon forget your brotherly care, which has equaled a father's and even a mother's kindness? Whether you live or die, we will live or die with you." They sought out a hollow tree to winter in, and contrived to carry their wounded nestmate thither, and before the rigor of the season had set in, they had, by diligence and economy, stored up food enough to carry them through the winter months. To make the provisions they had laid in last the better, it was agreed among them that 2 of their number should go south, leaving the other 3 to watch over, feed, and protect their wounded brother. The travelers set forth, sorry to leave home, but resolved that the first promise of spring should bring them back again. At the close of day, the 3 brothers who remained, mounting to the very peak of the tree and bearing Gray Eagle in their arms, watched them as they vanished away southward till their forms blended with the air and were wholly lost to sight. Their next business was to set the household in order, and this, with the judicious direction of Gray Eagle, who was propped up in a snug fork with soft cushions of dry moss, they speedily accomplished. One of the sisters, for there were two of these, took upon herself the charge of nursing Gray Eagle, preparing his food, bringing him water, and changing his pillows when he grew tired of one position. She also looked to it that the house itself was kept in a tidy condition, and that the pantry was supplied with food. The second brother was assigned the duty of physician, and he was to prescribe such herbs and other medicines as the state of the health of Gray Eagle seemed to require. As the second brother had no other invalid on his visiting list, he devoted the time not given to the cure of his patient to the killing of game wherewith to stock the housekeeper's larder, so that whatever he did, he was always busy in the line of professional duty, killing or curing. On his hunting excursions, Dr. Falcon carried with him his youngest brother, who, being a foolish young fellow and inexperienced in the ways of the world, it was not thought safe to trust alone. In due time, what with good nursing and good feeding and good air, Gray Eagle recovered from his wound, and he repaid the kindness of his brothers by giving them such advice and instruction in the art of hunting as his age and experience qualified him to impart. As spring advanced, they began to look about for the means of replenishing their storehouse, whose supplies were running low, and they were all quite successful in their quest except the youngest, whose name was Peepee, or the Pigeon Hawk, and who had of late begun to set up for himself. Being small and foolish and feather-headed, flying hither and yonder without any set purpose, it so happened that Peepee always came home, so to phrase it, with an empty game bag, and his pinions terribly rumpled. At last Gray Eagle spoke to him and demanded the cause of his ill luck. "It is not my smallness nor weakness of body," Peepee answered, "that prevents my bringing home provender as well as my brothers. I am all the time on the wing, hither and thither. I kill ducks and other birds every time I go out. But just as I get to the woods, on my way home, I am met by a large Ko-Ko-Ho who robs me of my prey, and," added Peepee with great energy, "it's my settled opinion that the villain lies in wait for the very purpose of doing so." "I have no doubt you are right, Brother Peepee," rejoined Gray Eagle. "I know this pirate. His name is White Owl, and now that I feel my strength fully recovered, I will go out with you tomorrow and help you look after this greedy bushranger." The next day they went forth in company and arrived at a fine freshwater lake. Gray Eagle seated himself hard by, while Peepee started out and soon pounced upon a duck. "Well done," thought his brother, who saw his success. But just as little Peepee was getting to land with his prize, up sailed a large white owl from a tree where he too had been watching, and laid claim to it. He was on the point of wresting it from Peepee when Gray Eagle, calling out to the intruder to desist, rushed up and, fixing his talons in both sides of the owl, without further introduction or ceremony, flew away with him. The little pigeon hawk followed closely, with the duck under his wing, rejoiced and happy to think that he had something to carry home at last. He was naturally much vexed with the owl, and had no sooner delivered over the duck to his sister, the housekeeper, than he flew in the owl's face, and venting an abundance of reproachful terms, would, in his passion, have torn the very eyes out of the white owl's head. "Softly, Peepee," said the gray eagle, stepping in between them. "Don't be in such a huff, my little brother, nor exhibit so revengeful a temper. Do you not know that we are to forgive our enemies? White Owl, you may go, but let this be a lesson to you, not to play the tyrant over those who may chance to be weaker than yourself." So after adding to this much more good advice, and telling him what kind of herbs would cure his wounds, Gray Eagle dismissed White Owl, and the 4 brothers and sisters sat down to supper. The next day, betimes, in the morning, before the household had fairly rubbed the cobwebs out of the corners of their eyes, there came a knock at the front door, which was a dry branch that lay down before the hollow of the tree in which they lodged, and being called to come in, who should make their appearance but the 2 nestmates, who had just returned from the south, where they had been wintering. There was great rejoicing over their return, and now that they were all happily reunited, each one soon chose a mate and began to keep house in the woods for himself. Spring had now revisited the north. The cold winds had all blown themselves away. The ice had melted, the streams were open, and smiled as they looked at the blue sky once more, and the forests, far and wide, in their green mantle, echoed every cheerful sound. But it is in vain that spring returns, and that the heart of nature is opened in bounty, if we are not thankful to the Master of Life, who has preserved us through the winter. Nor does that man answer the end for which he was made, who does not show a kind and charitable feeling to all who are in want or sickness, especially to his blood relations. The love and harmony of Gray Eagle and his brothers continued. They never forgot each other. Every week, on the 4th afternoon of the week, for that was the time when they had found their wounded elder brother, they had a meeting in the hollow of the old sycamore tree, when they talked over family matters and advised with each other as brothers should about their affairs. Near the mouth of the Yukon grows a tall, slender kind of grass, which the women gather and dry in the fall and use for braiding mats and baskets and for pads in the soles of skin boots. One of these grass stalks that had been almost pulled out by the roots when the women were gathering others did not like the fate in store for it. "Why should I stay on in this shape and never become anything but a pad in the sole of a boot to be trodden on forever? It must be nicer to be the one who treads on the pad. But since I cannot be that, I will at least be something better than grass." Looking about, it spied a bunch of herbs growing close by, looking so quiet and unmolested that the grass stem said, "I will be an herb. That is a higher and safer life than this." At once it was changed into an herb like those it had envied, and for a time it remained in peace. But one day the women came back with baskets and picks and began to dig up these herbs and eat some of the roots, putting others into the baskets to take home. The changed plant was left standing when the women went home toward evening, but it had seen the fate of its companions. "This is not very safe either, for now I should be eaten. I wish I had chosen some other form," it said. Looking down, it saw a tiny creeping vine clinging close to the ground. "That is the thing to be," it said. "That is so obscure and lowly that the women will never notice it. I will be a vine like that." Without delay, it became a little squawberry vine, nestling under the dead leaves. It had not lived in peace and seclusion very long before the women came and tore up many of the vines, stopping just before they reached the changeling and saying, "We will come back tomorrow and get the rest." The one-time grass plant was filled with fear and changed itself quickly into a small tuber-bearing plant, like some that were growing near. Scarcely had the change been made when a small tundra mouse came softly through the grass and began digging at a neighboring plant, holding up the tuber in its paws and nibbling it, after which the mouse crept on again. To be safe, I must be a mouse, thought the changeling. Animals are a higher kind of being than plants anyway. I will be a mouse. Instantly it became a mouse and ran off, glad of the change. Now and then it would pause to dig up a tuber, or would sit up on its hind feet to look around on the new scenes that came into view. This is much more delightful than being a plant and always staying in one place and never seeing anything of the world, it said. While traveling nimbly along in this manner, the mouse observed a strange white animal coming through the air toward it, which kept dropping down upon the ground, and after stopping to eat something, it would fly on again. When it came near, the mouse saw that it was a great white owl. At the same moment, the owl saw the mouse and swooped down upon it. Darting off, the mouse was fortunate enough to escape by running into a hole made by one of its kind, and the owl flew off. After a while, the mouse ventured to come out of its shelter, though its heart still beat painfully from its recent fright. I will be an owl, and in that way be safe, thought the mouse, and with a wish it was changed into a beautiful white owl. Oh, this is fine, he said. It is glorious to fly through the air and go up almost to the sky where I can look down on all the world. I'm glad that I was not content to stay always down in the dirt. With slow, noiseless wing flaps, the owl set off toward the north, pausing every now and then to catch and eat a mouse. After a long flight, Sledge Island came in view, and the owl thought it would go there. When far out at sea, its untried wings became so tired that only with the greatest difficulty did it manage to reach the shore, where it perched upon a piece of driftwood that stood up in the sand. In a short time, it saw two fine-looking men pass along the shore, and the old feeling of discontent arose again. Those men were talking in a better-sounding language than mine. They seemed to understand each other, and they laughed and were having a good time. I will be a man. With a single flap of wing, it stood upon the ground, where it changed immediately into a fine young man. But of course the feathers were gone, and the man had no clothing. Night came down upon the earth soon after, and the man sat down with his back against the stick of wood on which as an owl he had perched and slept till morning. He was awakened by the sun shining in his eyes, and upon arising felt stiff and lame from the cold night air. He found some of the same grass which he had once been, and braided it into a kind of mantle which kept out a little of the cold. Seeing a reindeer grazing, he felt a sudden desire to kill it and eat its flesh. He crept close on his hands and knees, and springing forward seized it by the horns and broke its neck with a single effort. He felt all over its body and found that its skin formed a covering through which he could not push his fingers. For a long time he tried to think how to remove the skin, and finally noticed a stone with a sharp edge with which he managed to cut through the hide. Then he quickly stripped the animal with his hands and tore out a piece of flesh which he tried to swallow as he had swallowed mice when he was an owl. He found that he could not do this easily, so he tore off small bits and ground them with his teeth. He had already discovered that by striking two stones together, they grew warm and felt good to his cold hands. So now he struck them together until sparks came, with which he lighted some dry weeds and brush and had a fire to cook his meat and to warm himself. The next morning he killed another reindeer, and the day following two more, and wrapped himself in their skins from head to foot, with the raw side next his own flesh, as the animals had worn them. The skins soon dried on him and became like a part of his body. As the nights grew colder and colder, he collected a quantity of driftwood from the shore, with which he built him a rude hut, which he found very comfortable. Walking over the hills one day, he came near to a strange black animal eating berries from the bushes. He crept up to it and grasped it by its hind legs. With an angry growl, it turned to face him, showing its white teeth. He knew then that he must not let go his hold of it, so he swung it high over his head and brought it down on the ground with such force that the bear lay dead. In skinning the bear, he saw that it contained much fat, and that he might have a light in his house if he could find something that would hold the grease and yet not take fire itself. Going along the beach, he found a long, flat stone with a hollow in one surface, and in this the oil remained very well, and with a lighted moss wick he found it much pleasanter to get about his house at night. The bear skin he hung up for a curtain to his door to keep out the cold wind. In this way he lived for many days, but he was a human being now and needed human society. He remembered the two young men he had seen on the beach when, as an owl, he sat on the post on the shore. "Two men passed here once, and I liked them," said he. "They may live not far from here. I should like to see someone like myself. I will go seek them." He went in search of people. Wandering along the coast for some distance, he came to two fine new kayaks lying at the foot of a hill, and in the kayaks were spears, lines, floats, and other hunting implements. After examining these curiously, he noticed a path leading up to a hill. He followed the path, and on the top of the hill he found a house with two storehouses near it, and several recently killed white whales and many skulls around it. Wishing to see the people in the house before showing himself, he went with noiseless steps into the entranceway and up to the door. Cautiously lifting one corner of the skin curtain that hung in the doorway, he looked in. Opposite the doorway was a young man sitting at work on some arrows, while a bow lay beside him. He dropped the curtain and stood for some time in doubt as to how to proceed. "If I enter the house, he may shoot me before I have time to make known my good will," thought he. But in the end he thought, "If I enter and say, 'I have come, brother,' he will not hurt me." So raising the curtain quickly, he entered. The householder at once seized the bow and drew an arrow to the head, just as the intruder said, "I have come, brother." At this, the bow and arrow were dropped, and the young man cried out with delight, "Are you my brother? Come and sit beside me." This the newcomer very gladly did, and the householder showed his pleasure and asked, "Are you really my brother? I am very glad to see you, brother, for I always believed I had one somewhere, though I never could find him. Where have you lived? Have you known any parents? How did you grow up? No, I have never known any parents. I never was born and never grew up. I just found myself a man standing on the seashore. There I built me a house and made myself as comfortable as I could. But I was lonely, so I came to find you. I also never had any parents that I can recall. My earliest recollection was of finding myself alone in this house where I have lived ever since, killing game for food. I was alone until this friend came to stay with me. Now you, my brother, shall live here too, and we will never be parted again. And thus, by always striving to be something higher, the downtrodden grass plant became a man.